The morning started like any other until Frank Brennan came storming through our front gate like he owned the place. Which, technically he did. But not for much longer, though he had no idea what was coming. I was watering my roses when I heard his heavy boots stomping up our walkway. My husband Jake was fixing the fence, whistling softly to himself. "Pack your bags," Frank shouted, waving papers in the air like victory flags. "You've got 30 days to get out of MY house." Every neighbor within 3 blocks could hear him. Mrs. Peterson stopped sweeping her porch. The Martinez family paused their yard work. Even old Mr. Thompson poked his head out from behind his newspaper. Frank wanted an audience, and he got one. I felt my hands start shaking, but something cold and determined settled in my chest. This man had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he was humiliating us, destroying us in front of everyone we knew. Instead, he was about to hand me the perfect stage for his own downfall. Jake dropped his hammer, his face going pale as Frank shoved the eviction notice toward him. Frank's smirk made my blood boil. He stood there in his expensive suit, looking down at us like we were insects he was about to squash. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before renting a place you can't afford," he sneered, loud enough for the whole street to hear. The neighbors weren't even pretending not to watch anymore. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be enjoying the drama. Frank was eating up every second of attention, puffing out his chest like a peacock, showing off his feathers. "This is what happens when people try to live beyond their means," he continued, his voice carrying across the yard. "Some folks just need to learn their place in life." Jake's jaw tightened, and I could see him fighting the urge to say something he'd regret. His pride was taking a beating with every word that came out of Frank's mouth. I reached over and squeezed his arm gently, a silent message to stay calm. Inside, my mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating and planning. Frank thought he was winning some kind of game, but he had no idea I'd been playing by different rules for months. Once Frank finally left, strutting down the street like he'd just conquered a kingdom, Jake and I went inside. The house felt different somehow, like the walls were closing in on us. Jake slumped into his favorite chair, running his hands through his hair. 20 years I've been working," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years, and I can't even keep a roof over our heads. What kind of man does that make me?" I sat down across from him, watching him struggle with shame that wasn't even his to carry. Frank had timed this perfectly, right when Jake was between jobs after his company downsized. The unemployment checks weren't enough to cover our rent, and Frank knew it. "Don't react," I said quietly, placing my hand on his knee. "Let me handle this." Jake looked up at me with confused eyes. "Handle what?" "We're getting evicted, Maria. There's nothing to handle except packing boxes and finding a new place to live." But I just smiled, that same calm smile I'd been practicing for months. What if I told you losing this house isn't the end? What if it's actually the beginning? The next morning, I started making phone calls. Jake watched me from the kitchen table, probably thinking I was calling friends and family to beg for money. I didn't correct him. Sometimes the best plans work better when people make their own assumptions about what you're doing. "Hello, this is Maria Santos," I said into the phone, walking into the other room where Jake couldn't hear the details. "I'd like to schedule a meeting about that property we discussed." When I came back, Jake was staring at his coffee like it might have answers written in the steam. "Who was that?" he asked without looking up. "Just someone who might be able to help," I replied, which was technically true. He nodded absently, lost in his own thoughts about job applications and apartment hunting. That afternoon, I made 2 more calls. Each conversation brought me closer to the moment when Frank Brennan would realize he'd picked a fight with the wrong woman. I'd been preparing for this possibility for over a year, ever since Frank started raising our rent every 6 months and treating us like we should be grateful for his generosity. I knew it was time to let Jake in on part of my secret, though not all of it. Not yet. Over dinner, I took a deep breath and prepared to shock my husband of 15 years. "Jake, I need to tell you something I've been hiding." He looked up from his plate, worry creasing his forehead. "What kind of hiding?" "For the past 3 years, I've been doing extra work. Cleaning offices downtown after my regular job. Babysitting for the neighbors' kids. Small things that brought in cash." I watched his face change as my words sank in. "I didn't tell you because I knew it would hurt your pride. You work so hard already. Jake set down his fork. How much extra work? Enough, I said simply. Enough that losing this rental isn't the disaster Frank thinks it is. The next part would sound impossible to him, but I needed to plant the seed. I've been talking to a real estate agent, Jake, about buying a house. This house. His mouth fell open. For a long moment, he just stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Then he started shaking his head. Maria, that's crazy. We can't afford to buy anything, especially not from Frank. He'd probably double the price just to spite us. Saturday morning at the grocery store, Frank spotted us in the cereal aisle. He made sure his voice carried to every corner of the store when he started his performance. Well, if it isn't the soon-to-be homeless couple, he announced, chuckling at his own joke. Other shoppers turned to stare. I felt Jake tense up beside me, his hands gripping the shopping cart handle, so tight his knuckles went white. Frank was enjoying himself, feeding off the attention like always. Better start looking at those apartment listings, Jake, Frank continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. Though I'm not sure anyone's going to want to rent to someone who couldn't handle their last place. That's when something interesting happened. Instead of the shame and anger I'd felt during his first performance, I felt completely calm. I even smiled a little, which seemed to confuse Frank. He was expecting tears, maybe begging. Instead, I just nodded politely and said, "We'll figure something out." The certainty in my voice must have thrown him off, because his smirk faltered for just a second. But then he recovered, laughing as he walked away. "Good luck with that figuring," he called over his shoulder. Monday morning, I told Jake I had a doctor's appointment. Another small lie to add to my growing collection, but necessary for what came next. Instead of going to the clinic, I drove across town to meet Amanda Chen at Riverside Realty. Amanda had been helping me navigate this plan for months, and she had news that made my heart race with excitement. "I've been digging into Frank Brennan's financial situation like you asked," she said, spreading documents across her desk. "You were right to be suspicious. The papers told a story that Frank would never want anyone to know. He was drowning in debt from bad investments and overspending. 3 of his rental properties were already in foreclosure, and he was desperate to sell our house quickly to avoid losing it too. Here's the interesting part," Amanda continued, pointing to a listing sheet. "Your house went on the market yesterday. He's asking for way less than it's worth because he needs cash fast." I leaned back in my chair, pieces clicking into place perfectly. Frank was so focused on humiliating us that he'd made himself vulnerable. His greed and ego were about to cost him everything. That evening, Jake cornered me in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. "Okay, Maria. No more secrets. What's really going on? You've been different ever since Frank showed up with those papers. You're too calm about this whole thing." I dried my hands slowly, buying time to choose my words carefully. Some truths were better revealed in stages, and Jake wasn't ready for the whole story yet. But he deserved to know we weren't as helpless as he thought. "I told you about the extra money," I began. "But I didn't tell you how much extra money. I've saved almost $50,000, Jake. Cash." He nearly dropped the plate he was holding. "50,000? How is that even possible?" 3 years of extra work. 3 years of living like we had no choice but to scrape by, while every spare dollar went into a secret account. I took his hands in mine. "And yesterday I put in an offer on this house. Our house." The color drained from his face as understanding hit him. "You offered to buy the house? From Frank? But that means..." "It means Frank Brennan is about to get the shock of his life." Friday night, Frank threw a barbecue in his backyard. We could hear the party from our kitchen window, loud voices and laughter carrying across the neighborhood. Jake and I stood there listening as Frank entertained his guests with stories about his latest business victory. So there I was, Frank's voice boomed over the fence, telling these deadbeat tenants they had 30 days to pack up and get out. You should have seen their faces. The husband looked ready to cry. His friends laughed along with his cruel jokes. Someone asked what he planned to do with the house once we were gone. "I'm thinking about turning it into 3 rental units," Frank replied. "Triple the income from the same space. It's all about maximizing profit, you know." Jake's hands curled into fists at his sides, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let him laugh tonight," I whispered, watching Frank hold court like he was some kind of business genius. Tomorrow, he's going to choke on every word. For the first time since this whole mess started, I saw something new in Jake's eyes. Not just hurt or shame, but curiosity. He was starting to see the steel in my voice. The call came Tuesday morning while Jake was out looking for work. Amanda's voice was professional, but I could hear the excitement underneath. Congratulations, Maria. They accepted your offer. The house is yours. I had to sit down as the reality hit me. After months of planning and saving, after years of Frank's condescending treatment and rent increases, we had won. Not just won, we had completely turned the tables on him. When can we close? I asked, my mind already jumping ahead to the moment of revelation. They want to move fast because of their financial situation. We can have everything finalized by next Friday. When Jake came home that afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a strange smile on my face. He looked at me suspiciously. You look like you know something I don't know. I do, I admitted. But you're going to have to trust me a little longer. Can you do that? He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I've trusted you for 15 years. I guess I can trust you a little more. The closing day felt like Christmas morning, and the final scene of a movie rolled into one. I signed paper after paper while Amanda handled the legal details. Every signature brought us closer to the moment when Frank would realize his world had just flipped upside down. Congratulations, the title company representative said, handing me a thick manila envelope. You are now the proud owners of 847 Maple Street. Inside the envelope was our deed, proof that Frank Brennan no longer had any power over us. But I made Jake promise not to tell anyone yet. The reveal had to be perfect, timed for maximum impact. I still can't believe this is real, Jake whispered as we drove home to our house. Our house. The words felt magical. It's real, I assured him, patting the envelope that contained our future. And next week, when Frank comes to make his final eviction speech, he's going to learn that some battles are lost before they even begin. That night, I lay awake planning every detail of what would happen when Frank came calling. He wanted a show? I was about to give him the performance of his lifetime. Frank arrived the following Tuesday with more swagger than usual. He'd brought boxes with him, stacked in the back of his truck like he was doing us a favor by helping us pack. The neighbors gathered again, drawn by the promise of more drama. All right, people, Frank announced to his audience. Today's the day these folks learn about real consequences. 30 days are up. He marched up to our front door with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. Behind him, I could see Mrs. Peterson shaking her head sadly, probably feeling sorry for us. The Martinez family watched from their porch, their children peering around their parents' legs. Frank pounded on our door with unnecessary force. Time's up, Santos family. Hope you've got somewhere to go, because you can't stay here anymore. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my dress, and prepared to deliver the most satisfying moment of my adult life. Jake stood behind me, deed in his hand, finally understanding his role in this carefully orchestrated finale. I opened the door with the biggest, brightest smile Frank had ever seen from me. His confident expression flickered with confusion for just a moment before his arrogance kicked back in. About time, he said. Where are your suitcases? Oh, you're absolutely right, Frank. I replied sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear. We don't live here anymore. His grin spread wider, thinking I was admitting defeat. Finally, some common sense. I was starting to think you people didn't understand plain English. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling bad for us. Frank basked in their attention, probably thinking he looked like some kind of successful businessman teaching valuable life lessons. You're completely correct, I continued, enjoying every second of his confusion. We don't live here anymore. We can't be tenants in a house we own. I held up the deed, official and undeniable. Congratulations, Frank. You just tried to evict your new landlords. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear birds chirping 3 houses away. Frank's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind him, Mrs. Peterson's hand flew to her chest in shock. The transformation on Frank's face was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. The color drained out of his cheeks as his eyes focused on the deed in my hands. His swagger disappeared, so fast he actually stumbled backward a step. That's impossible, he he sputtered, grabbing for the document. You can't afford to buy anything. You couldn't even afford rent. I handed him the deed calmly, watching as he read his own signature from the closing documents. His hands started shaking as the reality of what had happened sank in. Behind him, the neighbors were whispering among themselves, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. This has to be fake, Frank said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. This is some kind of trick. You forged these papers. Jake stepped forward, standing taller than I'd seen him in months. No tricks, Frank. Just good planning. Something you might want to learn about. The boxes in Frank's truck suddenly looked ridiculous, like props in a play where someone had forgotten their lines. He looked around at the neighbors, searching for support that wasn't coming. Nobody was laughing with him anymore. Frank's breakdown was spectacular and public. He started yelling about lawyers and fraud, waving his arms like he could somehow change reality through pure volume. This is impossible. I needed this money. You can't just steal my house. We didn't steal anything, I replied calmly. We bought it. With cash. At the price you were asking. The neighbors had gathered closer now, drawn by the drama but also genuinely curious about how this situation had flipped so completely. Mrs. Peterson actually started smiling, and I caught Mr. Thompson giving Jake a thumbs up from behind his newspaper. You people were supposed to be broke. Frank shouted, his face turning red with rage and humiliation. You were supposed to be failures. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. That's when I realized Frank had never seen us as real people with our own plans and capabilities. We were just characters in his story, meant to play the role of defeated tenants who would make him look successful. He couldn't handle discovering we had our own script. Sometimes, I said gently, things work out differently than people expect. As Frank continued to rant and rave in our front yard, something beautiful happened. The neighbors who had watched his earlier performances with mixed feelings now saw him for what he really was, a bully who had finally met his match. Mrs. Peterson walked over to congratulate us. I always knew you two were good people, she said, shooting a disapproving look at Frank. Some folks around here could learn about treating their neighbors with respect. The Martinez family joined the conversation, and suddenly Frank found himself surrounded by people who were celebrating our victory instead of his show of power. He looked around desperately, realizing his audience had turned against him. This isn't over, he threatened, but his words carried no weight anymore. I'll take you to court. I'll prove you cheated somehow. Jake stepped closer to Frank, no longer the broken man who had been shamed in this same yard weeks earlier. Go ahead and try, he said quietly. But right now, you need to get off our property. Frank's mouth opened and closed a few more times, but no words came out. He had nothing left to say. Watching Frank load his ridiculous boxes back into his truck was almost anticlimactic after his explosive reaction. He moved like a man in shock, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The neighbors were still gathered around, and their mood had shifted from entertainment to satisfaction. I can't believe you pulled this off, Mrs. Peterson said, shaking her head in amazement. All this time, we thought you were in trouble, but you were planning the whole thing. Jake wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and I could feel the pride radiating from him. My wife is the smartest woman I know, he said, loud enough for Frank to hear. I should have trusted her from the beginning. Frank slammed his truck door and drove away without looking back, leaving behind the boxes and the audience that had witnessed his defeat. As his truck disappeared around the corner, the neighbors began to disperse, but not before offering their congratulations and expressing their newfound respect. You showed him good, Mr. Thompson called out. About time someone put that man in his place. For the first time in weeks, our front yard felt peaceful again. That evening, Jake and I sat on our front porch, watching the sunset paint our neighborhood in golden light. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but somehow completely different. The house felt more solid, more permanent, more truly ours than it ever had when we were just renting. I still can't believe you kept this secret for so long, Jake said, shaking his head. 3 years of extra work. All those late nights I thought you were just tired from your regular job. I wanted to tell you, I admitted. But I knew you'd try to stop me from working so hard. And I knew we might need options someday. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing everything that had happened. "You saved us," he said finally. "Not just from Frank, but from giving up on ourselves." The phone rang inside the house, and I almost didn't answer it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I was surprised to hear Amanda's voice on the other end with an interesting update about Frank's situation. "You might want to hear this," she said. Word travels fast in real estate circles. Amanda's news was better than I could have hoped. Frank's financial problems were even worse than we'd known, and our house purchase had been his last chance to avoid complete bankruptcy. With that money gone to us instead of his creditors, his entire real estate empire was collapsing. 3 more properties went into foreclosure this week, Amanda reported. And his business reputation is ruined. People are talking about how he lost a house to the same tenants he was trying to evict. It's become a cautionary tale. When I shared this with Jake, he just shook his head in wonder. So while he was humiliating us in public, he was actually destroying himself? "Pride comes before a fall," I quoted. Frank was so busy showing off that he never bothered to find out who he was really dealing with. The next morning, we heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Frank had been forced to move out of his own house. Mrs. Peterson had the latest gossip. He was staying in a cheap motel across town while his lawyers tried to sort out his debts. "Karma," Jake said simply. "Sometimes it works faster than you expect." Within a week, our status in the neighborhood had completely changed. People who had barely nodded to us before now stopped to chat about our victory over Frank. The story had spread beyond our street, becoming local legend about the tenants who outsmarted their landlord. Mrs. Peterson brought us a casserole to celebrate our new homeownership. The Martinez family invited us to their daughter's birthday party. Even Mr. Thompson, who usually kept to himself, made a point of complimenting my business sense when he saw me working in the garden. "It feels like we're finally part of this community," Jake observed as we waved to another neighbor who was congratulating us. "All these years, and it took buying our own house to feel like we belonged here." "We always belonged here," I corrected gently. "It just took some people a while to notice." That afternoon, an unexpected visitor showed up at our door. Frank's truck was parked in our driveway again, but this time he looked very different. Gone was the expensive suit and confidence swagger. He looked tired, defeated, almost fragile. Frank's visit was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. He stood on our doorstep, hat in hand, literally and figuratively, asking for something he had no right to expect: mercy. "Maria," he began, his voice lacking any of its former arrogance. "I made a mistake. A big mistake." Jake and I exchanged glances. This was the same man who had humiliated us in front of our neighbors, who had treated us like we were beneath him. Now he was begging us for help with his financial troubles. "I need to buy the house back," he continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'll pay you more than you paid me. 20% more. I just need this one break to get back on my feet." The irony was perfect. Frank needed our house to save his financial empire, but buying it from us was what had destroyed that empire in the first place. He was trapped in a problem of his own making. I looked him straight in the eye and said the words I'd been waiting months to deliver. "Not a chance, Frank. This house isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." His face crumpled with the finality of those words. As Frank pleaded his case, trying every angle from sympathy to business logic, I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me. This man had tried to make us feel small and powerless, had used our temporary vulnerability as entertainment for the neighbors. Now he was learning what powerlessness really felt like. "You don't understand," Frank said, his voice getting higher with panic. "This house was part of my business plan. I counted on the money from selling it. Without it, I lose everything." "Then maybe you should have treated your tenants better," Jake replied firmly. "Maybe you should have thought about consequences before you decided to humiliate us in public." Frank looked back and forth between us, searching for any sign of weakness he could exploit. But we had learned something important over the past few weeks. We were stronger than we'd ever realized, and we didn't know anything to people who had tried to break us down. "This home was never yours," I told him, echoing words from a conversation that felt like a lifetime ago. "It's ours now, and you can't evict us from our own story." Frank's final departure from our lives was much quieter than his dramatic entrance had been. He left that day with slumped shoulders and empty hands, the fight completely gone out of him. We watched from our window as he drove away, probably for the last time. Within a month, the neighborhood gossip confirmed what Amanda had predicted. Frank's real estate business collapsed completely, taking with it the arrogant confidence that had defined him. His name became a cautionary tale whispered among local investors, the landlord who lost everything because he couldn't resist humiliating his tenants. Do you ever feel sorry for him? Jake asked one evening as we sat in our living room reading the newspaper. I considered the question carefully. I feel sorry for anyone who destroys their own life through pride and cruelty, but I don't regret protecting ourselves from becoming casualties of his mistakes. The house felt different now that it was truly ours. Every creaky floorboard and familiar corner held new meaning. We weren't just living here anymore. We were building something permanent. We spent the following months making changes that renters never can. Fresh paint and colors we actually liked. A vegetable garden in the backyard. New fixtures that reflected our taste instead of a landlord's budget choices. Every improvement felt like an act of rebellion against the version of ourselves that Frank had tried to create. Jake found a new job, better than his old one, and his confidence returned along with his sense of security. Funny how everything started falling into place once we stopped expecting the worst to happen, he observed while we were installing new kitchen cabinets. We never stopped expecting good things, I corrected him. We just learned to make them happen ourselves instead of waiting for permission. The house transformation became a symbol of our personal transformation. We weren't the desperate, powerless people Frank had tried to evict. We were homeowners, planners, people who could turn apparent defeat into total victory. Every nail we hammered felt like proof of what we'd accomplished together. Today, as I sit on our front porch sipping coffee and watching Jake wave to neighbors who now treat us with genuine respect, I think about the journey that brought us here. Frank tried to throw us out of this house, but instead, I built us a forever home. The morning sun catches the new house numbers we installed last week, numbers that represent our address, our investment, our future. Mrs. Peterson waves from her garden, and the Martinez children call out greetings as they walk to school. This is what belonging feels like. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Frank had simply been a decent landlord, if he had treated us with basic human respect instead of using our vulnerability as entertainment. He might still have his business, his reputation, his sense of power over others. But then Jake squeezes my hand and points to the roses I planted in our garden, and I realize that some stories are meant to end exactly the way they do. Frank's cruelty gave us the motivation to discover our own strength. His attempt to humiliate us became the stage for our greatest triumph. In the end, silence was the sweetest revenge, and patience was the greatest victory.